would I approve waterboarding? You bet your ass I'd approve it. You bet your ass. In a heartbeat. In a heartbeat. And I would approve more than that. And don't kid yourself, folks. It works, okay? It works. Only a stupid person would say it doesn't work. It works.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Cohen?
I guess it'll be easy for our viewers to understand what we might be talking about today. And it's an issue that we have dealt with over the last decade when we were in Washington while some of this torturing was going on and what we didn't know about it or we couldn't find out about it, even though we had some people attend the Liberty luncheons come in and from the CIA and reveal to us some of these things that were going on. But I think the one unknown we don't have yet is how much is going on? Could it be going on? And the subject today isn't so much that we know more about what could be going on today, but what we want to refer to is the Guardian article that got some material, got some a release of information from the CIA in a civil case from the families who lost loved ones who died in our torture camps, even though it's been many years ago. And this just, I think, was revealed this August. But the CIA was forced to release this, which is pretty fascinating because they really get around just about anything in releasing anything. But this reading this article, I don't know how it affected you, but it just was so ghastly. The detailed descriptions of what we were doing. Then all I could think of, does it do any good? And of course, years ago, I came to the conclusion it didn't do any good. And even if it did good, 1 out of 10,000, there was no moral justification for torturing and killing people who were innocent. And torture is essentially always, put on people who are suspects. They're not criminals that say, oh, well, they deserve it. You hear a lot of that. But they're guilty. They want to kill us, and they've done all this. And yet they are suspects. They've been picked up. I remember the one story in Guantanamo. I think the kid was 16 years old. Yeah. And so I think he finally did get released probably after 8 years or something. It was just horrible stories. But I know you've looked at this, and I know you probably had a similar reaction to how horrible this is. And of course, the anticipation, and they try and understand on whether our government is still involved. The clip that we got from our president is a little bit scary. That's a revealing statement, and it wasn't to me such an intellectual statement, but it was very, very emotional statement, which might make it even more dangerous.
Yeah, and these are, there was the Cobalt site in Afghanistan. The CIA was forced to release 274 memos to declassify them in the pretrial discovery phase for 2 survivors of this Cobalt camp that had been tortured. Of course, we mentioned Gul Rahman, who was the person who was killed in it. But when we first started thinking about this is all coming out now, and there's a lot. The Guardian did a good piece, and Zero Hedge has a good synopsis of it. But you're tempted to say, okay, this was 10 years ago. We were already assured by Obama, no more torture. It's all over. But then that's why we decided to lead with this clip, as you'd mentioned, because, okay, we don't know that President Trump has authorized another camp like this, but we do know what his intentions are. Now, he did, after this clip, he did say, well, I will defer to Mattis, to Secretary Mattis, if Mattis thinks torture is bad. But we have a sense of what's in his mind. So putting the two together, I think that's why we're trying to do the show today, and that's why I think it's very relevant.
Right, and one of their justification is in that atmosphere which had a stronger emotion component, back then. They say, well, this is war on terrorism. We've been attacked, war on terrorism. But how can you have war on terrorism with trying to outdo them with terror? I mean, this is terror. But you know, the definition of terror is sometimes way too narrow in the sense everybody thinks, well, a terrorist is a bad guy that has radical Islamic terrorists and they want to kill us. And all of a sudden, well, maybe there are other things that are terroristic. And when I think about it, what is going on today? We're still dropping bombs on people. A lot. Matter of fact, we dropped more bombs this month on Afghanistan we haven't since 2010. In the last 7 years, it was 751 bombing attacks on it. That has to be terror. And also, we use sanctions rather, casually. People suffer from that. Children die from it. So, yes, it's easy to visualize this. It's a horror. But this whole thing of policy, when you have no justification, and of course we haven't seen the justification in many, many decades for us to be involved in these other countries, killing people and assassinating people and taking control of their country and participating in coups. So this is something else. And this whole idea, nobody has repealed the Bush doctrine of preemption. Mm-hmm. Oh, we do not wait. We do not wait. We have to do it. And I saw one thing, and we were talking about North Korea, and I guess they were talking to Mattis about, are we going to or aren't we going? He says, the whole thing is absolutely up to President Trump. Well, when did this all happen? But that's the attitude. So it's that atmosphere and policy, but still identifying this should warn a lot of people. And of course, the other thing that has always bothered me about is medical professionals being involved. That really is a personal annoyance to me. And 2 doctors were involved here. They say psychologists, and they would, supervise it so nobody would die in there. The one time they were looking at it and they said, "Oh yeah, it looks pretty tough, but safe." So not quite so safe according to what we're learning.
Yeah, and it's an important point you made earlier. I think you made it before, but it really bears repeating. First of all, we do know that President Trump has loosened the rules of engagement in Afghanistan.
That's another.
We know that, and we know that they've radically increased airstrikes, the most since November of 2010. So put the two of them together. When you say loosen rules of engagement, it sounds very antiseptic, but the reality means that more signature strikes. You're going to strike people not because you identified them as a terrorist, but because they fit a profile, a male between the ages of 16 and 60, something of this nature. So that means you're going to be sweeping up a lot of civilians. So if you're a male of that age and you're not fighting against anyone, when you hear a drone overhead, you're going to be struck with a terror feeling. You'll be terrorized. And so essentially this is a terror program.
And the purpose of being cautious with the rules of engagement, they should have decided sooner, like, why are we engaged at all?
Yeah.
But then they come in, well, we're going to use drones and things that we should be careful and not kill civilians and that sort of thing. But I would think that just this last month, 751 bombings in Afghanistan, increasing number of troops there, increasing the spending over there, that there's no way they're going to have the numbers go down on how many civilians we've been killing and how many children die as a consequence of this. And 16 years now we've been there, and the administration and his supporters, he knew, he wasn't bashful about this. No. We need more. We need to win. We need to be tough. What was one of the first things he did was he dropped the biggest bomb, non-nuclear bomb in the world on Afghanistan. Not to kill people, but to send a message. This is what we're going to do. So he's following up. He's very consistent. But the American people, I think, are very consistently asleep. I think that is the problem. And if nothing else, I wished we would have the success of awakening some people to just look at this, look at what has been said. Most of the time, what happens in a country shouldn't be a total surprise. It's like if there was never a discussion of this and then something horrible happened, well, where did that come from? I didn't know Trump believed in this, and I thought maybe he was less interventionist like we had hoped, but it turns out he's not less interventionist, and people like to win, but just to win when it's not a morally justified war, what is the purpose? Do you really win? That was the reason we were in Vietnam. We really lost, and there was all the sacrifice and all the loss of life that occurred there. And yet we're not making a lot of progress here in getting the American people to say enough is enough. How many people in Congress now, and you probably have a good idea by looking at some of these votes, how many in the House and the Senate would now vote to cut a significant amount of money that might mean something from the military budget?
Probably a lot less even than voted with Rand on that amendment. A very small handful. But you talk about winning. Nobody even knows what winning looks like in Afghanistan. Secretary Mattis was tasked with coming up with a grand new strategy for Afghanistan. He worked and worked months and months and months. He unveiled that strategy a month or so ago, and essentially it was, our new strategy is we're not going to tell you anything about our strategy. We're not going to signal anything. So there's nothing. No one knows what winning looks like. But you mentioned the doctors, and I think we should go back into the torture, because this is really, in some ways, the most gruesome part. Because we all remember the Nazis and how they used people in the medical profession to conduct horrible experiments. Dr. Bruce Jessen and Dr. James Mitchell, they designed this torture regime in Afghanistan. Not only did they design it, not only did they turn their back on the Hippocratic Oath, but they were well paid. $81 million these two guys made from designing a horrible torture program, and in the case of Gul Rahman, sleep deprivation, rough treatment, cold shower, minimum food and drink, environmental deprivation, i.e. being kept in the dark for extended periods, and he suffered a slow death. He died chained from the waist to a concrete floor with nothing on but a diaper.
And froze to death.
So they were paid $81 million for this.
And well, we're spreading American exceptionalism. It's just disgusting when we read that and find out that this is our country that is doing this. But it's not our policies. It's not what we want, and we don't, condone it. And we would like to suggest there is a much better way to handle foreign policy.
And Americans who cheered when then candidate Trump said that, they should be shown a picture of this and say, is this really what you want? Some of them may say yes, but the fact of the matter is we do know that torture doesn't work. It's been proven that it doesn't work, because when you're under a situation of extreme stress like that, you will tell your interrogator, your torturer, anything you think that person wants to hear to let up. And a lot of times, some of these guys who are tortured there, they weren't giving anything, even though they were tortured. And then they moved to a different line of questioning, and they started getting information. It turns out this was just something that the guy knew something about. He didn't know anything about the other stuff.
The motivation is interesting. You've already alluded to it, that it looks like money could have been a motivation, that make millions of dollars doing this, because it's so hard for me to comprehend somebody in the medical field that's doing exactly the opposite. Instead of the preservation of life, they're dealing with a strategy to kill. Well, they think they're just doing the Lord's work and getting information to save us from being bombed. I mean, that's probably their rationalization, but I think their minds must be clouded, by not even dealing with, the Hippocratic Oath, and not even divorcing themselves from the idea of making money. That has clouded a lot of people's minds over the centuries on how money influences them.
And it's very sad you're bringing up the issue of religion. Bruce Jessen is apparently a bishop in the Mormon Church. So you think a man of religious faith, of religious values, would not be involved in treating his fellow man like this. And as you say, this is a suspect. He's not been proven to have committed any crime or terrorism. A suspect. That's very depressing.
And Mormons I know a lot of Mormons. They're very patriotic, and they do this in the idea of patriotism. But the support for the war is patriotic. That they want it to be patriotic. To support the military, it's everything militaristic is patriotic. And in the accusations, which I have been on the receiving end, is you're un-American. You don't care about the troops, and you don't care about defending one's country, and which is absolutely wrong. But they will argue that the patriotism is a strong, powerful weapon, and the population, the people, like that idea. Yes, it's painful to go to war, but it's for the good of the country. But the good of the country means not the people, but the good of the government and the military-industrial complex and the empire. That's what it's good for. But how often do we hear that on television? Essentially never. And if you do, you're some type of subversive, that you would say that maybe our leaders aren't doing what is best for our country. Because the real tragedy here is you hear a lot of this bickering going on between Republicans and Democrats, but there's really no essential philosophic differences between the leadership of the Republican Party and the Democrat Party when it comes to foreign policy. And probably there was no strong, we could barely get anybody to talk about this before. No strong coalition of Republicans and Democrats say, that we shouldn't be doing this. And it was known. It wasn't on the evening news. We are getting more information now, but isn't it sad that it takes this long to figure this out? And the other thing is when you lose a war or even win a war, the history is written by the people who want to have an axe to grind, and they distort it, so it's real hard to get the information. So it always, sadly, it takes decades sometimes to find out what the real story is about why we did certain things and how many people suffered. That's why I think this article, is very much worthwhile, as difficult it is for me to read it and talk about it because it's so gruesome. But the people should know about this. But I'd like to see the transition from this ghastly stuff to things that are equally ghastly, because when I look at it and see the wounded warriors and they're held in very, very high esteem and they deserve some the credit for it all, but from my viewpoint, it wasn't necessary, and that to me makes it more tragic that so much suffering has occurred, and suffering is suffering, and terrorism is manifold, and that is why I think the main tool that we deal with is trying to get the information the best we can and get it to as many people as possible.
Yeah, they can accuse you of not caring about the troops, but the funny part is the troops cared about you, and they cared about you a lot.
Yeah, that always made me feel better.
So that's the silver lining. I'm going to close it, but I do want to remind our viewers that we seem to be back on live streaming. So fingers crossed we can solve some of our problems. The final point I wanted to make, Dr. Paul, is simple. Gul Rahman, who died on November 20, 2002, he was involved in a faction called Hezb-e-Islami. That faction had been previously funded by the CIA. Then they fell out of favor and he was nabbed and tortured. But then in 2010, they reconciled with the U.S.-backed government in Afghanistan, and then they became good buddies again. So he just got caught at the wrong time because his guys were supported, opposed, and supported again.
You mean to say our government was inconsistent in what they do?
Shocking.
But it's part of the policy we have, this casual, careless intervention. We're on both sides of all issues. Most weapons that we send over the different factions ends up helping our enemies and hurting us. So it's real tragic. For me, it is very difficult to say, well, what we have to have are better generals, and we have to have better politicians, more wise in picking and choosing their battles, and have more moralistic people who won't torture. That is not the answer. That is not going to work. The only thing that's going to work is when this country and the people endorse on principle and the moral principle of non-aggression principle, that we don't get involved in these wars and that we don't have an interventionist foreign policy. As bad as things are overseas, we have never made things better just because we go get involved in internal affairs of other nations. So this is the reason it would be best for the American people to study carefully and just figure out exactly what it means to be a non-interventionist in foreign policy, as we should be on our personal liberties and our economic liberties. The non-interventionist is a key word if you want to live in a free society and strive for peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Come back soon.